The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 10. Diplomacy. Bryce went back to Wrychester firmly convinced that Mark Ransford had killed John Braden. He reckoned things up in his own fashion. Some years must have elapsed since Braden, or rather Brake's, release. He had probably heard on his release that Ransford and his, Brake's, wife had gone abroad. In that case he would certainly follow them. He might have lost all trace of them. He might have lost his original interest in his first schemes of revenge. He might have begun a new life for himself in Australia, whence he had undoubtedly come to England recently. But he had come at last, and he had evidently tracked Ransford to Wrychester. Why, otherwise, had he presented himself at Ransford's door on that eventful morning which was to witness his death? Nothing, in Bryce's opinion, could be clearer. Brake had turned up. He and Ransford had met, most likely in the precincts of the cathedral. Ransford, who knew all the quiet corners of the old place, had in all probability induced Brake to walk up into the gallery with him, had noticed the open doorway, had thrown Brake through it. All the facts pointed to that conclusion. It was a theory which, so far as Bryce could see, was perfect. It ought to be enough, proved, to put Ransford in a criminal dock. Bryce resolved it in his own mind over and over again as he sped home to Wrychester. He pictured the police listening greedily to all that he could tell them if he liked. There was only one factor in the whole sum of the affair which seemed against him: the advertisement in the Times. If Brake desired to find Ransford in order to be revenged on him, why did he insert that advertisement as if he were longing to meet a cherished friend again? But Bryce gaily surmounted that obstacle. Full of shifts and subtleties himself, he was ever ready to credit others with trading in them, and he put the advertisement down as a clever ruse to attract, not Ransford, but some person who could give information about Ransford. Whatever its exact meaning might have been, its existence made no difference to Bryce's firm opinion that it was Mark Ransford who flung John Brake down St. Wrytha's Stair and killed him. He was as sure of that as he was certain that Braden was Brake. And he was not going to tell the police of his discoveries. He was not going to tell anybody. The one thing that concerned him was how best to make use of his knowledge with a view to bringing about a marriage between himself and Mark Ransford's ward. He had set his mind on that for 12 months past, and he was not a man to be balked of his purpose. By fair means or foul, he himself ignored the last word and would have substituted the term skilful for it, Pemberton Bryce meant to have Mary Bewery. Mary Bewery herself had no thought of Bryce in her head when, the morning after that worthy's return to Wrychester, she set out, alone, for the Wrychester Golf Club. It was her habit to go there almost every day, and Bryce was well acquainted with her movements and knew precisely where to waylay her. And empty of Bryce though her mind was, she was not surprised when, at a lonely place on Wrychester Common, Bryce turned the corner of a spinney and met her face to face. Mary would have passed on with no more than a silent recognition. She had made up her mind to have no further speech with her guardian's dismissed assistant. But she had to pass through a wicket gate at that point, and Bryce barred the way, with unmistakable purpose. It was plain to the girl that he had laid in wait for her. She was not without a temper of her own, and she suddenly let it out on the offender. "Do you call this manly conduct, Dr. Bryce?" she demanded, turning an indignant and flushed face on him. "To waylay me here, when you know that I don't want to have anything more to do with you? Let me through, please, and go away." But Bryce kept a hand on the little gate, and when he spoke there was that in his voice which made the girl listen in spite of herself. "I'm not here on my own behalf," he said quickly. "I give you my word, I won't say a thing that need offend you. It's true, I waited here for you. It's the only place in which I thought I could meet you, alone. I want to speak to you. It's this. Do you know your guardian is in danger?" Bryce had the gift of plausibility. He could convince people against their instincts, even against their wills, that he was telling the truth. And Mary, after a swift glance, believed him. "What danger?" she asked. "And if he is, and if you know he is, why don't you go direct to him?" "The most fatal thing in the world to do," exclaimed Bryce. "You know him. He can be nasty. That would bring matters to a crisis, and that in his interest is just what mustn't happen." "I don't understand you," said Mary. Bryce leaned nearer to her, across the gate. "You know what happened last week," he said in a low voice. "The strange death of that man, Braden." "Well?" she asked, with a sudden look of uneasiness. "What of it?" "It's being rumoured, whispered in the town, that Dr. Ransford had something to do with that affair," answered Bryce. "Unpleasant, unfortunate, but it's a fact." "Impossible!" exclaimed Mary with a heightening colour. "What could he have to do with it? What could give rise to such foolish, wicked rumours?" "You know as well as I do how people talk, how they will talk," said Bryce. "You can't stop them, in a place like Wrychester, where everybody knows everybody. There's a mystery around Braden's death. It's no use denying it. Nobody knows who he was, where he came from, why he came. And it's being hinted, I'm only telling you what I've gathered, that Dr. Ransford knows more than he's ever told. There are, I'm afraid, grounds." "What grounds?" demanded Mary. While Bryce had been speaking, in his usual slow, careful fashion, she had been reflecting and remembering Ransford's evident agitation at the time of the Paradise affair, and his relief when the inquest was over, and his sending her with flowers to the dead man's grave. And she began to experience a sense of uneasiness and even of fear. "What grounds can there be?" she added. "Dr. Ransford didn't know that man, had never seen him." "That's not certain," replied Bryce. "It is said remember, I'm only repeating things it is said that just before the body was discovered, Dr. Ransford was seen, mind you, leaving the west porch of the cathedral, looking as if he had just been very much upset. 2 persons saw this." "Who are they?" asked Mary. "That I'm not allowed to tell you," said Bryce, who had no intention of informing her that one person was himself and the other imaginary. "But I can assure you that I am certain, absolutely certain, that their story is true. The fact is, I can corroborate it." "You!" she exclaimed. "I," replied Bryce. "I will tell you something that I have never told anybody up to now. I shan't ask you to respect my confidence. I've sufficient trust in you to know that you will, without any asking. Listen. On that morning Dr. Ransford went out of the surgery in the direction of the Deanery, leaving me alone there. A few minutes later a tap came at the door. I opened it and found a man standing outside." "Not that man?" asked Mary fearfully. "That man, Braden," replied Bryce. "He asked for Dr. Ransford. I said he was out. Would the caller leave his name? He said no. He had called back because he had once known a Dr. Ransford, years before. He added something about calling again, and he went away, across the close towards the cathedral. I saw him again, not very long afterwards, lying in the corner of Paradise, dead." Mary Bewery was by this time pale and trembling, and Bryce continued to watch her steadily. She stole a furtive look at him. "Why didn't you tell all this at the inquest?" she asked in a whisper. "Because I knew how damning it would be to Ransford," replied Bryce promptly. "It would have excited suspicion. I was certain that no one but myself knew that Braden had been to the surgery door. Therefore, I thought that if I kept silence, his calling there would never be known. But I have since found that I was mistaken. Braden was seen going away from Dr. Ransford." "By whom?" asked Mary. "Mrs. Deramore, at the next house," answered Bryce. "She happened to be looking out of an upstairs window. She saw him go away and cross the Close." "Did she tell you that?" demanded Mary, who knew Mrs. Deramore for a gossip. "Between ourselves," said Bryce, "she did not. She told Mrs. Folliot. Mrs. Folliot told me." "So it is talked about!" exclaimed Mary. "I said so," assented Bryce. "You know what Mrs. Folliot's tongue is." "Then Dr. Ransford will get to hear it," said Mary. "He will be the last person to get to hear of it," affirmed Bryce. "These things are talked of, hole and corner fashion, a long time before they reach the ears of the person chiefly concerned." Mary hesitated a moment before she asked her next question. "Why have you told me all this?" she demanded at last. "Because I didn't want you to be suddenly surprised," answered Bryce. "This, whatever it is, may come to a sudden head, of an unpleasant sort. These rumours spread, and the police are still keen about finding out things concerning this dead man. If they once get it into their heads that Dr. Ransford knew him—" Mary laid her hand on the gate between them, and Bryce, who had done all he wished to do at that time, instantly opened it and she passed through. "I am much obliged to you," she said. "I don't know what it all means, but it is Dr. Ransford's affair, if there is any affair, which I doubt. Will you let me go now, please?" Bryce stood aside and lifted his head, and Mary, with no more than a nod, walked on towards the golf clubhouse across the common, while Bryce turned off to the town, highly elated with his morning's work. He had sown the seeds of uneasiness and suspicion broadcast. Some of them, he knew, would mature. Mary Bewery played no golf that morning. In fact, she only went to the clubhouse to rid herself of Bryce, and presently she returned home, thinking. And indeed, she said to herself, she had abundant food for thought. Naturally candid and honest, she did not at that moment doubt Bryce's good faith. Much as she disliked him in most ways, she knew that he had certain commendable qualities, and she was inclined to believe him when he said that he had kept silence in order to ward off consequences which might indirectly be unpleasant for her. But of him and his news she thought little. What occupied her mind was the possible connection between the stranger who had come so suddenly and disappeared so suddenly and forever, and Mark Ransford. Was it possible, really possible, that there had been some meeting between them in or about the cathedral precincts that morning? She knew, after a moment's reflection, that it was very possible. Why not? And from that her thoughts followed a natural trend. Was the mystery surrounding this man connected in any way with the mystery about herself and her brother? That mystery of which, as it seemed to her, Ransford was so shy of speaking. And again, and for the 100th time, she asked herself why he was so reticent, so evidently full of dislike of the subject, why he could not tell her and Dick whatever there was to tell, once for all. she had to pass the Folliots' house in the far corner of the close on her way home, a fine old mansion set in well-wooded grounds, enclosed by a high wall of old red brick. A door in that wall stood open, and inside it, talking to one of his gardeners, was Mr. Folliot. The vistas behind him were gay with flowers, and rich with the roses which he passed all his days in cultivating. He caught sight of Mary as she passed the open doorway and called her back. "Come in, and have a look at some new roses I've got," he said. "Beauties! I'll give you a handful to carry home." Mary rather liked Mr. Folliot. He was a big, half-asleep sort of man, who had few words and could talk about little else than his hobby. But he was a passionate lover of flowers and plants, and had a positive genius for rose culture, and was at all times highly delighted to take flower lovers round his garden. She turned at once and walked in, and Folliot led her away down the scented paths. "It's an experiment I've been trying," he said, leading her up to a cluster of blooms of a colour and size which she had never seen before. "What do you think of the results?" "Magnificent!" exclaimed Mary. "I never saw anything so fine." "No," agreed Folliot, with a quiet chuckle, "nor anybody else, because there is no such rose in England. I shall have to go to some of these learned parsons in the Close to invent me a Latin name for this. It's the result of careful experiments in grafting. Took me 3 years to get at it. And see how it blooms, scores on one standard." He pulled out a knife and began to select a handful of the finest blooms, which he presently pressed into Mary's hand. "By the by," he remarked as she thanked him and they turned away along the path, "I wanted to have a word with you, or with Ransford. Do you know, does he know, that confounded silly woman who lives near to your house, Mrs. Deramore, has been saying some things, or a thing, which, to put it plainly, might make some unpleasantness for him?" Mary kept a firm hand on her wits, and gave him an answer which was true enough, so far as she was aware. "I'm sure he knows nothing," she said. "What is it, Mr. Folliot?" "Why, you know what happened last week," continued Folliot, glancing knowingly at her. "The accident to that stranger. This Mrs. Deramore, who's nothing but an old chatterer, has been saying here and there that it's a very queer thing Dr. Ransford doesn't know anything about him and can't say anything, for she herself, she says, saw the very man going away from Dr. Ransford's house not so long before the accident." "I am not aware that he ever called at Dr. Ransford's," said Mary. "I never saw him, and I was in the garden, about that very time, with your stepson, Mr. Folliot." "So Sackville told me," remarked Folliot. "He was present, and so was I, when Mrs. Deramore was tattling about it in our house yesterday. He said then that he'd never seen the man go to your house. You never heard your servants make any remark about it?" "Never," answered Mary. "I told Mrs. Deramore she'd far better hold her tongue," continued Folliot. "Tittle-tattle of that sort is apt to lead to unpleasantness. And when it came to it, it turned out that all she had seen was this stranger strolling across the Close as if he'd just left your house. If, there's always some if. But I'll tell you why I mentioned it to you," he continued, nudging Mary's elbow and glancing covertly first at her and then at his house on the far side of the garden. "Ladies that are getting on a bit in years, you know, like my wife, are apt to let their tongues wag, and between you and me, I shouldn't wonder if Mrs. Folliot has repeated what Mrs. Deramore said, And I don't want the doctor to think that if he hears anything, you know, which he may, and again he might, To think that it originated here! So if he should ever mention it to you, you can say it sprang from his next-door neighbour. Bah, they are a lot of old gossips, these close ladies." "Thank you," said Mary. "But supposing this man had been to our house, what difference would that make? He might have been for half a dozen reasons." Folliot looked at her out of his half-shut eyes. "Some people would want to know why Ransford didn't tell that at the inquest," he answered. "That's all. When there's a bit of mystery, you know, no?" He nodded, as if reassuringly, and went off to rejoin his gardener. And Mary walked home with her roses, more thoughtful than ever. Mystery? A bit of mystery? There was a vast and heavy cloud of mystery. And she knew she could have no peace until it was lifted. End of chapter 10.
The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 11. The Back Room. In the midst of all her perplexity at that moment, Mary Bewery was certain of one fact about which she had no perplexity nor any doubt. It would not be long before the rumours of which Bryce and Mr. Folliot had spoken. Although she had only lived in Wrychester a comparatively short time, she had seen and learned enough of it to know that the place was a hotbed of gossip. Once gossip was started there, it spread, widening in circle after circle. And though Bryce was probably right when he said that the person chiefly concerned was usually the last person to hear what was being whispered, she knew well enough that sooner or later this talk about Ransford would come to Ransford's own ears. But she had no idea that it was to come so soon, nor from her own brother. Lunch in the Ransford menage was an informal meal. At 1:15 every day it was on the table, a cold lunch to which the three members of the household helped themselves as they liked, independent of the services of servants. Sometimes all three were there at the same moment, sometimes Ransford was half an hour late. The one member who was always there to the moment was Dick Bewery, who fortified himself sedulously after his morning's school labours. On this particular day all three met in the dining-room at once and sat down together. And before Dick had eaten many mouthfuls of a cold pie to which he had just liberally helped himself, he bent confidentially across the table towards his guardian. "There's something I think you ought to be told about, sir," he remarked with a side glance at Mary. "Something I heard this morning at school. You know, we've a lot of fellows, town boys, who talk." "I dare say," responded Ransford dryly. "Following the example of their mothers, no doubt. Well, what is it?" He too glanced at Mary, and the girl had her work set to look unconscious. "It's this," replied Dick, lowering his voice in spite of the fact that all three were alone. "They're saying in the town that you know something which you won't tell about that affair last week. It's been talked of." Ransford laughed, a little cynically. "Are you quite sure, my boy, that they aren't saying that I daren't tell?" he asked. "Daren't is a much more likely word than won't, I think." "Well, about that, sir," acknowledged Dick. "Comes to that, anyhow." "And what are their grounds?" inquired Ransford. "You've heard them, I'll be bound." "They say that man, Braden, had been here, to the house, that morning, not long before he was found dead," answered Dick. "Of course I said that it was all bosh. I said that if he'd been here and seen you, I'd have heard of it. Dead certain. "That's not quite so dead certain, Dick, as that I have no knowledge of his ever having been here," said Ransford. "But who said he came here?" "Mrs. Deramore," replied Dick promptly. "She says she saw him go away from the house and across the close, a little before 10. So Jim Deramore says, anyway, and he says his mother's eyes are as good as another's." "Doubtless," assented Ransford. He looked at Mary again and saw that she was keeping hers fixed on her plate. "Well," he continued, "if it will give you any satisfaction, Dick, you can tell the gossips that Dr. Ransford never saw any man, Braden or anybody else, at his house that morning, and that he never exchanged a word with Braden. So much for that. But," he added, "you needn't expect them to believe you. I know these people. If they've got an idea into their heads, they'll ride it to death. Nevertheless, what I say is a fact." Dick presently went off, and once more Ransford looked at Mary, and this time Mary had to meet her guardian's inquiring glance. "Have you heard anything of this?" he asked. "That there was a rumour, yes," she replied without hesitation, "but not until just now, this morning." "Who told you of it?" inquired Ransford. Mary hesitated. Then she remembered that Mr. Folliot, at any rate, had not bound her to secrecy. "Mr. Folliot," she replied. "He called me into his garden to give me those roses, and he mentioned that Mrs. Deramore had said these things to Mrs. Folliot, and he seemed to think it highly probable that Mrs. Folliot would repeat them. He told me because he didn't want you to think that the rumour had originally arisen at his house." "Very good of him, I'm sure," remarked Ransford dryly. "They all like to shift the blame from one to another. But," he added, looking searchingly at her, "you don't know anything about Braden's having come here?" He saw at once that she did, and Mary saw a slight shade of anxiety come over his face. "Yes, I do," she replied. "That morning. But it was told to me only today, in strict confidence." "In strict confidence?" he repeated. "May I know by whom?" "Dr. Bryce," she answered. "I met him this morning. And I think you ought to know. Only it was in confidence." She paused for a moment, looking at him, and her face grew troubled. "I hate to suggest it," she continued, "but will you come with me to see him, and I'll ask him, things being as they are, to tell you what he told me? I can't without his permission." Ransford shook his head and frowned. "I dislike it," he said. It's putting ourselves in his power, as it were. But I'm not going to be left in the dark. Put on your hat, then." Bryce, ever since his coming to Wrychester, had occupied rooms in an old house in Friary Lane, at the back of the Close. He was comfortably lodged. Downstairs he had a double sitting-room extending from the front to the back of the house. His front window looked out on one garden, his back window on another. He had just finished lunch in the front part of his room, and was looking out of his window, wondering what to do with himself that afternoon, when he saw Ransford and Mary Bewery approaching. He guessed the reason of their visit at once, and went straight to the front door to meet them, and without a word mentioned them to follow him into his own quarters. It was characteristic of him that he took the first word, before either of his visitors could speak. "I know why you've come," he said, as he closed the door and glanced at Mary. "You either want my permission that you should tell Dr. Ransford what I told you this morning, or you want me to tell him myself. Am I right?" "I should be glad if you would tell him," replied Mary. "The rumour you spoke of has reached him. He ought to know what you can tell. I have respected your confidence, so far." The two men looked at each other, and this time it was Ransford who spoke first. "It seems to me," he said, "that there is no great reason for privacy. If rumours are flying about in Wrychester, there is an end of privacy. Dick tells me they are saying at the school that it is known that Braden called on me at my house shortly before he was found dead. I know nothing whatever of any such call. But I left you in my surgery that morning. Do you know if he came there? Yes, answered Bryce. He did come. Soon after you'd gone out. Why did you keep that a secret? Demanded Ransford. You could have told it to the police, or to the coroner, or to me. Why didn't you? Before Bryce could answer, all three heard a sharp click of the front garden gate, and looking round, saw Michigan coming up the walk. Here's one of the police now, said Bryce calmly. Probably come to extract information. I would much rather he didn't see you here. But I'd also like you to hear what I shall say to him. Step inside there, he continued, drawing aside the curtains which shut off the back room. Don't stick at trifles. You don't know what may be afoot. He almost forced them away, drew the curtains again, and hurrying to the front door, returned almost immediately with Mitchington. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, Doctor," said the inspector as Bryce brought him in and again closed the door. "Not? All right, then. I came round to ask you a question. There's a queer rumour getting out in the town about that affair last week. Seems to have sprung from some of those old dowagers in the Close." "Of course," said Bryce. He was mixing a whisky and soda for his caller, and his laugh mingled with the splash of the siphon. "Of course, I've heard it." "You've heard?" remarked Mitchington. Good health, sir. Heard, of course, that Braden called on Dr. Ransford not long before the accident, or murder, or whatever it was, happened," said Bryce. "That's it, eh?" "Something of that sort," agreed Mitchington. "It's being said, anyway, that Braden was at Ransford's house, and presumably saw him, and that Ransford, accordingly, knows something about him which he hasn't told. Now, what do you know? Do you know if Ransford and Braden did meet that morning?" "Not at Ransford's house, anyway," answered Bryce promptly. "I can prove that. But since this rumour has got out, I'll tell you what I do know, and what the truth is. Braden did come to Ransford's, not to the house, but to the surgery. He didn't see Ransford. Ransford had gone out, across the Close. Braden saw me." "Bless me! I didn't know that," remarked Mitchington. "You never mentioned it." "You'll not wonder that I didn't," said Bryce, laughing lightly, "when I told you what the man wanted." "What did he want, then?" asked Mitchington. "Merely to be told where the cathedral library was," answered Bryce. Ransford, watching Mary Bewery, saw her cheeks flush, and knew that Bryce was cheerfully telling lies. But Mitchington evidently had no suspicion. "That's all?" he said. "Just a question?" "Just a question. That question," replied Bryce. "I pointed out the library, and he walked away. I never saw him again until I was fetched to him, dead. And I thought so little of the matter that, well, it never even occurred to me to mention it." "Then, though he did call, he never saw Ransford?" asked the inspector. "I tell you Ransford was already gone out," answered Bryce. "He saw no one but myself. Where Mrs. Darramore made her mistake, I happen to know, Mitchington, that she started this rumour, was in trying to make 2 and 2 into 5. She saw this man crossing the Close, as if from Ransford's house, and she at once imagined he'd seen and been talking with Ransford." "Old fool!" said Mitchington. "Of course! That's how these tales get about. However, there's more than that in the air." The two listeners behind the curtains glanced at each other. Ransford's glance showed that he was already chafing at the unpleasantness of his position, but Mary's only betokened apprehension. And suddenly, as if she feared that Ransford would throw the curtains aside and walk into the front room, she laid a hand on his arm and motioned him to be patient and silent. "Oh?" said Bryce. "More in the air? About that business? Just so, assented Mitchington. To start with, the man Varner, the mason, has never ceased talking. They say he's always at it, to the effect that the verdict of the jury at the inquest was all wrong, and that the evidence was put clean aside. He persists that he did see what he swore he saw. He'll persist in that to his dying day, said Bryce carelessly. If that's all there is— It isn't, interrupted the inspector, not by a long chalk. But Varner's is a direct affirmation, the other matter's a sort of ugly hint. There's a man named Collishaw, a townsman, who's been employed as a mason's labourer about the cathedral of late. This Collishaw, it seems, was at work somewhere up in the galleries, ambulatories, or whatever they call those upper regions, on the very morning of the affair. And the other night, being somewhat under the influence of drink, and talking the matter over with his mates at a tavern, he let out some dark hints that he could tell something if he liked. Of course he was pressed to tell them, and wouldn't. Then, so my informant tells me, he was dared to tell, and became surlily silent. That, of course, spread, and got to my ears. I've seen Collishaw. Well? Asked Bryce. I believe the man does know something, answered Mitchington. That's the impression I carried away anyhow. But he won't speak. I charged him straight away with knowing something, but it was no good. I told him of what I'd heard. All he would say was that whatever he might have said when he'd got a glass of beer or so too much, he wasn't going to say anything now, neither for me nor for anybody. Just so, remarked Bryce. But he'll be getting a glass too much again some day, and then perhaps he'll add to what he said before. And you'll be sure to hear of it. I'm not certain of that, answered Mitchington. I made some inquiry, and I find that Collishaw is usually a very sober and retiring sort of chap. He'd been lured into drink when he let out what he did. Besides, whether I'm right or wrong, I got the idea into my head that he'd already been squared. Squared? Exclaimed Bryce. Why then, if that affair was really murder, he'd be liable to being charged as an accessory after the fact. I warned him of that, replied Mitchington. Yes, I warned him solemnly. With no effect? Asked Bryce. He's a surly sort of man, said Mitchington. The sort that takes refuge in silence. He made no answer beyond a growl. Do you really think he knows something? Suggested Bryce. Well, if there is anything, it'll come out in time. Oh, it'll come out, assented Mitchington. I'm by no means satisfied with that verdict of the coroner's inquiry. I believe there was foul play of some sort. I'm still following things up quietly, and I'll tell you something between ourselves. I've made an important discovery. It's this: on the evening of Braden's arrival at the Mitre, he was out somewhere for a whole 2 hours by himself. I thought we learned from Mrs. Partingley that he and the other man, Dellingham, spent the evening together, said Bryce. So we did. But that was not quite so, replied Mitchington. Braden went out of the Mitre just before 9 o'clock, and he didn't return until a few minutes after 11. Now then, where did he go? I suppose you're trying to find that out? Asked Bryce, after a pause, during which the listeners heard the caller rise and make for the door. Of course, replied Mitchington with a confident laugh. And I shall. Keep it to yourself, Doctor. When Bryce had let the inspector out and returned to his sitting-room, Ransford and Mary had come from behind the curtains. He looked at them and shook his head. You heard a good deal, you see, he observed. Look here, said Ransford peremptorily. You put that man off about the call at my surgery. You didn't tell him the truth. Quite right, assented Bryce. I didn't. Why should I? What did Braden ask you? Demanded Ransford. Come now. "Merely if Dr. Ransford was in," answered Bryce, remarking that he had once known a Dr. Ransford. "That was literally all. I replied that you were not in." Ransford stood silently thinking for a moment or two. Then he moved towards the door. "I don't see that any good will come of more talk about this," he said. "We three, at any rate, know this. I never saw Braden when he came to my house." Then he motioned Mary to follow him, and they went away, and Bryce, having watched them out of sight, smiled at himself in his mirror with full satisfaction. End of chapter 11.
Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 12. Murder of the Mason's Labourer. It was towards noon of the very next day that Bryce made a forward step in the matter of solving the problem of Richard Jenkins and his tomb in Paradise. Ever since his return from Barthorpe, he had been making attempts to get at the true meaning of this mystery. He had paid so many visits to the cathedral library that Ambrose Campany had asked him jestingly if he was going in for archaeology. Bryce had replied that having nothing to do just then, he saw no reason why he shouldn't improve his knowledge of the antiques of Wrychester. But he was scrupulously careful not to let the librarian know the real object of his prying and peeping into the old books and documents. Campany, as Bryce was very well aware, was a walking encyclopedia of information about Wrychester Cathedral. He was, in fact, at that time engaged in completing a history of it, and it was through that history that Bryce accidentally got his precious information. For on the day following the interview with Mary Bewery and Ransford, Bryce, being in the library, was treated by Campany to an inspection of certain drawings which the librarian had made for illustrating his work drawings, most of them of old brasses, coats of arms, and the like. And at the foot of one of these, a drawing of a shield on which was sculptured 3 crows. Bryce saw the name Richard Jenkins, armiger. It was all he could do to repress a start and to check his tongue. But Campany, knowing nothing, quickly gave him the information he wanted. "All these drawings," he said, "are of old things in and about the cathedral. Some of them, like that, for instance, that Jenkins shield, are of ornamentations on tombs which are so old that the inscriptions have completely disappeared, tombs in the cloisters and in Paradise. Some of those tombs can only be identified by these sculptures and ornaments." "How do you know, for instance, that any particular tomb or monument is, we'll say, Jenkins's?" asked Bryce, feeling that he was on safe ground. "Must be a matter of doubt if there's no inscription left, isn't it?" "No," replied Campany, "no doubt at all. In that particular case, there's no doubt that a certain tomb out there on the corner of Paradise, near the east wall of the south porch, is that of one Richard Jenkins, because it bears his coat of arms, which, as you see, bore these birds, intended either as crows or ravens. The inscription's clean gone from that tomb, which is why it isn't particularized in that chart of burials in Paradise. The man who prepares that chart didn't know how to trace things as we do nowadays. Richard Jenkins was, as you may guess, a Welshman who settled here in Wrychester in the 17th century. He left some money to St. Hedwige's Church, outside the walls, but he was buried here. There are more instances. Look at this now, this coat of arms. That's the only means there is of identifying another tomb in Paradise, that of Jervis Tyrrwhit. You see his armorial bearings in this drawing? Now those—" Bryce let the librarian go on talking and explaining, and heard all he had to say as a man hears things in a dream. What was really active in his own mind was joy at this unexpected stroke of luck. He himself might have searched for many a year and never found the last resting-place of Richard Jenkins. And when, soon after the great clock of the cathedral had struck the hour of noon, he left Campany and quitted the library, he walked over to Paradise and plunged in amongst its yews and cypresses, intent on seeing the Jenkins tomb for himself. No one could suspect anything from merely seeing him there, and all he wanted was one glance at the ancient monument. But Bryce was not to give even one look at Richard Jenkins's tomb that day, nor the next, nor for many days. death met him in another form before he had taken many steps in the quiet enclosure where so much of Wrychester mortality lay sleeping. From over the topmost branches of the old yew trees a great shaft of noontide sun fell full on a patch of the grey walls of the high-roofed nave. At the foot of it, his back comfortably planted against the angle of a projecting buttress, sat a man, evidently fast asleep in the warmth of those powerful rays. His head leaned down and forward over his chest. His hands were folded across his waist. His whole attitude was that of a man who, having eaten and drunken in the open air, has dropped off to sleep. That he had so dropped off while in the very act of smoking was evident from the presence of a short, well-blackened clay pipe, which had fallen from his lips and lay in the grass beside him. Near the pipe, spread on a coloured handkerchief, were the remains of his dinner. Bryce's quick eye noticed fragments of bread, cheese, onions. And close by stood one of those tin bottles in which labouring men carry their drink. Its cork, tied to the neck by a piece of string, dangled against the side. A few yards away, a mass of fallen rubbish and a shovel and wheelbarrow showed at what the sleeper had been working when his dinner hour and time for rest had arrived. Something unusual, something curiously noticeable, yet he could not exactly tell what, made Bryce go closer to the sleeping man. There was a strange stillness about him, a rigidity which seemed to suggest something more than sleep. And suddenly, with a stifled exclamation, he bent forward and lifted one of the folded hands. It dropped like a leaden weight when Bryce released it, and he pushed back the man's face and looked searchingly into it. And in that instant he knew that for the second time within a fortnight he had found a dead man in Wrychester Paradise. There was no doubt whatever that the man was dead. His hands and body were warm enough, but there was not a flicker of breath. He was as dead as any of the folk who lay 6 feet beneath the old gravestones around him, and Bryce's practised touch and eye knew that he was only just dead, and that he had died in his sleep. Everything there pointed unmistakably to what had happened. The man had eaten his frugal dinner, washed it down from his tin bottle, lighted his pipe, leaned back in the warm sunlight, dropped asleep, and died as quietly as a child taken from its play to its slumbers. After one more careful look, Bryce turned and made through the trees to the path which crossed the old graveyard. And there, going leisurely home to lunch, was Dick Bewery, who glanced at the young doctor inquisitively. "Hullo!" he exclaimed, with the freedom of youth towards something not much older. "You there! Anything on?" Then he looked more clearly, seeing Bryce to be pale and excited. Bryce laid a hand on the lad's arm. "Look here," he said. "There's something wrong again, in here. Run down to the police station. Get hold of Mitchington, quietly, you understand. Bring him here at once. If he's not there, bring somebody else, any of the police. But say nothing to any of them." Dick gave him another swift look, turned, and ran. And Bryce went back to the dead man and picked up the tin bottle, and making a cup of his left hand, poured out a trickle of the contents. Cold tea, and as far as he could judge, nothing else. He put the tip of his little finger into the weak-looking stuff and tasted. It tasted of nothing but a superabundance of sugar. He stood there, watching the dead man, until the sound of footsteps behind him gave warning of the return of Dick Bewery, who, in another minute, hurried through the bushes, followed by Mitchington. The boy stared in silence at the still figure, but the inspector, after a hasty glance, turned a horrified face on Bryce. "Good Lord!" he gasped. "It's Collishaw!" Bryce for the moment failed to comprehend this, and Mitchington shook his head. "Collishaw!" he repeated. "Collishaw, you know. The man I told you about yesterday afternoon. The man that said—" Mitchington suddenly checked himself, with a glance at Dick Bewery. "I remember now," said Bryce. "The mason's labourer." "So this is the man, eh? Well, Mitchington, he's dead. I found him dead just now. I should say he'd been dead 5 to 10 minutes, not more. You'd better get help, and I'd like another medical man to see him before he's removed." Mitchington looked again at Dick. "Perhaps you'd fetch Dr. Ransford, Mr. Richard?" he asked. "He's nearest." "Dr. Ransford's not at home," said Dick. "He went to Highminster, some county council business or other, at 10 this morning, and he won't be back until 4. I happen to know that. Shall I run for Dr. Coates?" "If you wouldn't mind," said Mitchington. "And as it's close by, drop in at the station again and tell the sergeant to come here with a couple of men. I say," he went on when the boy had hurried off, "this is a queer business, Dr. Bryce. What do you think?" "I think this," answered Bryce. "That man, look at him, a strong, healthy-looking fellow, in the very prime of life. That man has met his death by foul means. You take particular care of those dinner things of his, the remains of his dinner, every scrap, and of that tin bottle. That especially. Take all these things yourself, Mitchington, and lock them up. They'll be wanted for examination." Mitchington glanced at the simple matters which Bryce indicated, and suddenly he turned a half-frightened glance on his companion. "You don't mean to say that you suspect he's been poisoned?" he asked. "Good Lord, if that is so—" "I don't think you'll find that there's much doubt about it," answered Bryce. "But that's a point that will soon be settled. You'd better tell the coroner at once, Mitchington, and he'll issue a formal order to Dr. Coates to make a post-mortem. And," he added significantly, "I shall be surprised if it isn't, as I say, poison." "If that's so," observed Mitchington with a grim shake of his head, "if that really is so, then I know what I shall think. This," he went on, pointing to the dead man, "this is a sort of sequel to the other affair. There's been something in what the poor chap said. He did know something against somebody, and that somebody's got to hear of it, and silenced him. But, Lord, Doctor, how can it have been done?" "I can see how it can have been done, easy enough," said Bryce. "This man has evidently been at work here by himself all the morning. He, of course, brought his dinner with him. He no doubt put his basket and his bottle down somewhere while he did his work. What easier than for someone to approach through these trees and shrubs while the man's back was turned, or he was busy round one of these corners, and put some deadly poison into that bottle? Nothing." "Well," remarked Mitchington, "if that's so, it proves something else, to my mind." "What?" asked Bryce. "Why, that whoever it was who did it was somebody who had a knowledge of poison," answered Mitchington. "And I should say there aren't many people in Wrychester who have such knowledge outside yourselves and the chemists. It's a black business, this." Bryce nodded silently. He waited until Dr. Coates, an elderly man who was the leading practitioner in the town, arrived, and to him he gave a careful account of his discovery. And after the police had taken the body away, and he had accompanied Mitchington to the police station, and seen the tin bottle and the remains of Collishaw's dinner safely locked up, he went home to lunch, and to wonder at this strange development. The inspector was doubtless right in saying that Collishaw had been done to death by someone who wanted to silence him, but who could that somebody be? Bryce's thoughts immediately turned to the fact that Ransford had overheard all that Mitchington had said, and in that very room in which he, Bryce, was then lunching. Ransford! Was it possible that Ransford had realized a danger in Collishaw's knowledge, and had— He was interrupted at this stage by Mitchington, who came hurriedly in with a scared face. I say," he whispered as soon as Bryce's landlady had shut the door on them. "Here's a fine business. I've heard something I can hardly credit, but it's true. I've been to tell Collishaw's family what's happened, and I'm fairly dazed by it. It is so." "What's so?" demanded Bryce. "What is it that's true?" Mitchington bent closer over the table. "Dr. Ransford was fetched to Collishaw's cottage at 6 o'clock this morning," he said. It seems that Collishaw's wife had been in a poor way about her health of late, and Dr. Ransford has attended her, on and off. She had some sort of a seizure this morning, early, and Ransford was sent for. He was there some little time, and I've heard some queer things." "What sort of queer things?" demanded Bryce. "Don't be afraid of speaking out, man. There's no one to hear but myself." "Well, things that look suspicious on the face of it," continued Mitchington, who was obviously much upset, "as you'll acknowledge when you hear them. I got my information from the next-door neighbour, Mrs. Batts. Mrs. Batts says that when Ransford, who'd been fetched by Mrs. Batts's eldest lad, came to Collishaw's house, Collishaw was putting up his dinner to take to work." "What on earth made Mrs. Batts tell you that?" interrupted Bryce. "Oh, well, to tell you the truth, I put a few questions to her as to what went on while Ransford was in the house," answered Mitchington. "When I once found out that he had been there, you know, I naturally wanted to know all I could." "Well?" asked Bryce. "Collishaw, I say, was putting up his dinner to take to his work," continued Mitchington. "Mrs. Batts was doing a thing or two about the house. Ransford went upstairs to see Mrs. Collishaw. After a while he came down and said he would have to remain a little. Collishaw went up to speak to his wife before going out. And then Ransford asked Mrs. Batts for something, I forget what, some small matter which the Collishaws hadn't got, and she had, and she went next door to fetch it. Therefore, do you see? Ransford was left alone with Collishaw's tin bottle." Bryce, who had been listening attentively, looked steadily at the inspector. "You're suspecting Ransford already?" he said. Mitchington shook his head. "What's it look like?" he answered almost appealingly. "I put it to you now, what does it look like? Here's this man been poisoned without a doubt, I'm certain of it. And there was those rumours. It's idle to deny that they centred in Ransford. And this morning Ransford had the chance." "That's arguing that Ransford purposely carried a dose of poison to put into Collishaw's tin bottle," said Bryce half sneeringly. "Not very probable, you know, Mitchington." Mitchington spread out his hands. "Well, there it is," he said. "As I say, there's no denying the suspicious look of it. If I were only certain that those rumours about what Collishaw hinted he could say had got to Ransford's ears, why then—" "What's being done about that post-mortem?" asked Bryce. "Dr. Coates and Dr. Everest are going to do it this afternoon," replied Mitchington. "The coroner went to them at once, as soon as I told him." "They'll probably have to call in an expert from London," said Bryce. "However, you can't do anything definite, you know, until the result's known. Don't say anything of this to anybody. I'll drop in at your place later and hear if Coates can say anything really certain." Mitchington went away, and Bryce spent the rest of the afternoon wondering, speculating and scheming. If Ransford had really got rid of this man who knew something, why then it was certainly Ransford who killed Braden. He went round to the police station at 5 o'clock. Mitchington drew him aside. "Coates said there's no doubt about it," he whispered. "Poisoned. Hydrocyanic acid." End of chapter 12.